Hello, welcome to the history of Mr. Brown, or Mr. Brown's Neighborhood, as the original show was called. I'm going to jump right in here, because much like Johnny Thunder, I'm not 100% sure on the origins of the character, like why I wanted to do him. I'm a huge fan of Saturday Night Live, and when I was younger, I was given by my mother a couple of SNL VHS tapes, and one of them happened to be the best of Eddie Murphy. Now, a quick backtrack, and then I'll get back to that. Fred Rogers, the late and amazingly great Fred Rogers, is to this day, and I consider because of his words, wisdom, and just his basically lessons on kindness, he always probably will be one of my heroes. His words are fantastic. And so I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I almost messed up there. Of course, I was born in 1992, so I actually did get to watch quite a big chunk of the show. I don't really remember when he died, per se, because I think they kind of reran some of them in syndication. It wasn't until later that I kind of came to my knowing that he was no longer alive. But anyway, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers, and then with Saturday Night Live, I watched the Eddie Murphy's Best of on VHS, and that, of course, had Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, which, of course, is a parody of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And when I was in high school, in fact, it was 2009, I just wanted to do something that was like my brother William was very young at the time, so he was watching a lot of children's programming, and I wanted to do something that was a parody of that genre. And so, thinking back to Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, and then of course Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I came up with this idea that whatever I did was going to be somebody's neighborhood. I don't know where the name Mr. Brown exactly came from, but I do know that the first episode, and the first couple episodes really, were called Mr. Brown's Neighborhood, which made little to no sense, although I did, in some of the earlier episodes, actually parody the coming into the room and taking off my street clothes and putting on his costume, which we'll get to in a minute. And so that, combined with my love of Mr. Bean, who is a character from a show called Mr. Bean, portrayed by Rowan Atkinson, his kind of bizarre, off-brand humor, all that combined with my own kind of dark humor, I created Mr. Brown. And that was 2009, and this is, of course, 2020, and I'm still occasionally doing Mr. Brown episodes. So Mr. Brown, much like a lot of my characters, has kind of a costume. And there's a story behind this I'll get to in a minute. But for those of you who don't know, this is Mr. Brown's t-shirt. The design has been his t-shirt since the very beginning. Now, this is not the original shirt. The original shirt that I had when I started doing Mr. Brown was just a part of my wardrobe. Just a shirt I picked. It wasn't actually the shirt that I wore in the first episode, but I did for a couple episodes in a row, and before I knew it, that was Mr. Brown's kind of costume. No glasses and that shirt. So the original shirt, I decided I was going to end Mr. Brown for good for some reason. Well, there is a reason. We'll get to that later, too. So I gave the shirt to my best friend / cousin / Mr. Brown's biggest fan as a Christmas gift. And later on, when I decided that I wanted to start up Mr. Brown again, I said, hey, is there any way, I know it was a gift, but is there any way I could borrow the shirt back? And she told me no, because the shirt no longer existed. She had lost it in moving, which that happens all the time. There's a cassette, actually, that I talked about in the KRL episode of this show that I don't have anymore. which sucks. But anyway, I didn't have it, so I kind of went back. I don't know if I used this one in particular, but I just went back to blue shirts because that was the color of it. So any blue shirt I had kind of became Mr. Brown's. Well, last year, 2019, was the 10th anniversary of Mr. Brown. So I decided I would go on searching. By the way, this apparently is the rarest shirt form that you can find. I mean, the rarest shirt design, not form. And I paid way too much money for this, and it's like 2 sizes too small. So if anybody happens to have this shirt in like a large or extra large, I will happily buy that from you. So anyway, I bought that for the 10th anniversary, and I'm back to using that, as uncomfortable as it may be, for Mr. Brown. So that's the history of the weird history of the shirt. Like Benny and Martha, Mr. Brown is improv. I come up with an episode kind of theme, and he's different because of course he's visual, not audio, so I will get him together. I used to put together like a bag of props that I was going to use throughout the episode. Like it was Christmas. He was going to get Christmas presents, and here's a bag full of Christmas episodes he's going to use. Christmas presents that I'm going to, whatever. And, yeah. But other than that, what he did with them was kind of all on me or him, us. Again, there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to get into later that's going to make all this kind of mystery stuff make sense. And it's also why this is going to be probably the longest of the series. The first episode, I don't even think it's up on YouTube anymore because it said some really nasty things about religion and religious people. And stuff that, it's iffy even for a teenager to be saying it, which I was about 16 when I started Mr. Brown. But to have it up now was a no-no as far as I was concerned, so I got rid of that. And right from the beginning, right from episode 1, I established that Mr. Brown was into puppetry and was a ventriloquist. He wasn't a very good one, neither was I, go figure. But he was a ventriloquist, and he had several puppets, Wubsy, Wubser, Wobble. I don't know why I stuck with W, but they all seem to start with a W, and he was a ventriloquist. I think, and that kind of, I don't know where that came. I mean, Mr. Rogers always had the land of make-believe, and I never tried to parody that. But I think having those puppets and doing that kind of puppetry is where that came from, and the idea of using puppets in Mr. Brown's world. And also, I've always loved puppets and puppetry. In addition to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, I also watched Sherry Lewis's multiple shows growing up with Lamb Chop and Charlie Horse and Hush Puppy. I've always loved puppets for some reason. They're kind of fun. You can make them do things that you wouldn't do, and they're kind of, I'd like to think, more funny because, a person can. They're like cartoon characters that you can hold, if that makes sense. There's a brief connection in one of the episodes of Mr. Brown to Benny and Martha, where he describes that he used to date Martha, which, as I explained in the Benny and Martha episode, that explains why he is definitely not Andy Brown, who is Benny and Martha's grandson. And Mr. Brown now, I think when I started, he was like in his 50s. I decided he was going to be an older man. I don't know why, but that's something that I did. So that still doesn't really make sense on the grand scheme of him dating a now 80-year-old woman. But again, the lore has evolved over time, thank goodness. One thing that I kind of still do is he's always kind of been into reading children's books. And what I like about reading children's books is as Mr. Brown, I kind of go through and I read what's on the page, and I also add myself. I love rhyming books because it's really fun to kind of improv things as you go through. You read a line, and then instead of reading that next line, you just improv a line. There's one in particular, which was an early Christmas episode, and it had, he read a book called Bear Can't Sleep or something like that, and I think that one is quite funny from a personal standpoint. And then there was another thing that I tried to do, and I wish I'd finished it now. We have to talk about it because of something that it led to, was an alphabet series. In this alphabet series, he was going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. All the letters were going to represent a little skit. Kind of like going, like I mentioned with SNL, that was kind of when I was really getting more and more into SNL at that time. And I figured this was a good time for me to start kind of experimenting more with things. So A was for arsenic. And in that one, I brought in my brother, Joe, who played a character named Bill. And if you are a Mr. Brown fan at all, which you may not be, that's fine too, you'll know that Bill is a recurring character on Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown thinks Bill is his best friend, by the way. So Bill was in that episode. He was in another one. Well, he wasn't really. My brother played another character in another Mr. Brown who was not Bill. Let's be realistic. It was probably Bill. But Bill would return later as kind of a bring back everything into what was the unofficial kind of anniversary episode. This is where it's going to take a little turn, okay? We're going to take a little turn for the dark. We're going to come back to fun for a little bit, and then we're going to go back a little bit to the dark. And that's your warning. Here we go. So when I was in high school is when I said I was 16 when I started doing Mr. Brown. And I started to gain actually a bit of a following to the point where I had some fans. Mr. Brown had actual fans. People who actually followed the show. And I kind of took him into school with me. And I didn't call him Mr. Brown. I wound up calling him the Creeper, which is not a... basically, I would try to creep people out. And then to the point where if anybody were able to make me cringe, and when I was in high school, it was a badge of honor. And it got to the point where it was kind of out of control. I don't want to say that he was like a alter ego. That does not, now that I think about it, that doesn't even start to make sense. But at the time, it did get a little bit out of hand. I had to get people to help me stop being the Creeper. It was a whole thing. And again, this is something we're gonna talk about a little bit more later. But I was hiding in that there old metaphorical closet, as it were, and I just had no idea what was happening. So I was using Mr. Brown, who was just an openly gay man character, to, I don't know, try to, like, ask for help, like, reach out and say, take me, like, just tell me that I can be both things. I don't know. It was weird, and it was not a good experience, but when I graduated high school in the yearbook, I put that the Creeper was my nickname because it was kind of my way of signing him off. You know what I mean? And I continued doing Mr. Brown in college, and it was just, he kept evolving to the point where he was not that weird, kind of creepy old man anymore. Anyway, I think I'm going to stop here for this episode, and I'm actually going to have this be a two-parter because we're already almost 15 minutes in here. So, the 2 episodes will be uploaded simultaneously. But for now, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy part 2.